Japan wasn't defeated by battleships or by bombs, but by invisible weapons no sailor ever saw coming. Weapons that sank no aircraft carriers, captured no islands, and didn't even need a pilot to return from mission. They waited in silence, hidden beneath salt water, and quietly strangled an empire. These were not just explosives, they were a plan, a weapon of starvation, designed not to kill soldiers on the battlefield, but to collapse a nation before the battlefield even mattered. In early 1945, Japan still believed it could survive the war, not win, survive. The Japanese army dug trenches around cities and rail yards, civilians trained with bamboo spears, pilots prepared for kamikaze missions. The empire braced itself for a final invasion and imagined a heroic defense, a national sacrifice. The government expected a fight of fire and steel. What it never imagined was losing the war through hunger, empty fuel tanks, and silent harbors. Japan looked powerful from the outside, a massive army, fierce pilots, and millions ready to die for the emperor. But like a tree rotten at the core, the empire hid a fatal weakness. It could not feed itself. It could not power itself. It did not have oil, steel, rubber, or even enough rice to survive a war of years. Everything it needed to function, food from Korea, coal from Hokkaido, fuel from Indonesia, steel from China, had to travel through the Pacific Ocean. Japan's empire was not held together by land, it was held together by merchant ships. Ships were not just vessels, they were lifelines. When they stopped moving, the empire starved, factories went dark, cities lost power, and the armies defending Japan's beaches were left, with empty fuel tanks, silent guns, and no food to fight on. Japan did not rely on the ocean as territory, it relied on the ocean as an umbilical cord, and someone inside the U.S. military was about to cut it. In Washington, the conversation about ending the war centered on two options: destroy cities or invade them. The Navy argued for more submarines and battleships. The Army Air Forces argued for strategic bombing. The Marines prepared for a horrific island invasion. Everyone expected millions of casualties. Then a group of logistics planners noticed something peculiar. Japan's merchant fleet had already shrunk dramatically. It had lost ships to submarines, aircraft, and island battles. The empire was struggling to move food and fuel. Coal stockpiles were shrinking. Factories slowed down. If those shipping losses continued just a little more, the entire country would collapse without an invasion. That discovery led to a radical idea. What if instead of dropping bombs, the United States dropped mines? Not a few, thousands, tens of thousands, enough to turn the sea into a death trap, enough to make merchant sailing impossible, enough to force Japan into economic suffocation. Mines sounded boring. They weren't heroic like dogfights or dramatic like torpedo launches. They didn't look impressive on newsreels, but they were perfect for one task: shutting down a nation's arteries. Mines didn't need fuel. They didn't miss. They didn't require pilots to come home. They waited patiently, and they never stopped working until they killed something or blocked it completely. The Navy argued that mining waters required ships and submarines, and those were too slow for such a massive campaign. You couldn't scatter enough mines to strangle the empire fast enough. Then Curtis LeMay read the proposal. LeMay was blunt, calculating, and utterly obsessed with efficiency. Victory to him wasn't about glory, it was about speed. He believed that the longer the war continued, the more lives would be wasted. American, Japanese, civilian, soldier, it didn't matter. End the war as quickly as possible, that was his morality. When he heard the mining idea, he immediately understood its potential. He didn't see mines as defensive weapons, he saw them as economic bombs, capable of detonating Japan's ability to exist as a war machine. He made a decision no one expected. The most advanced bombers in the world, B-29 superfortresses, would no longer focus solely on burning cities. They would become mine layers. They would take the fight into Japan's supply routes, not its factories. Operation Starvation was born. The name was cold. It was meant to be. This was not a campaign to destroy fleets or sink destroyers. It was a campaign to suffocate a nation. The goal was to shut down Japan's ability to fight by starving its industry, cutting off its fuel, and leaving its army with no supplies to move or defend. To accomplish this, America needed more than an idea. It needed the right weapon. The mines built for the operation were not simple metal cans. They were highly engineered traps. Some were magnetic mines that triggered when a ship's steel hull passed above. Others were acoustic mines that listened for propeller vibrations. There were pressure mines that detonated when a vessel displaced water above them. Some floated, some lay on the seabed. Some were designed specifically to resist removal. If a Japanese minesweeper attempted to tamper with one, the mine could adjust sensitivity or explode prematurely. Every type of mine forced the Japanese Navy to respond differently. Sweep for magnetic mines, and acoustic mines would wait. Sweep for acoustic mines, and pressure mines would trigger. Even if a ship wasn't sunk, the mere fear of mines slowed Japan's shipping to a crawl. Convoys stopped, rerouted, or turned back. Each mine wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological warfare. But how do you deliver thousands of mines fast enough to strangle an empire? Submarines were too few, destroyers too visible, naval aviation lacked the range. The answer was shocking: heavy bombers flying low at night. B-29 crews were trained for high-altitude precision bombing, not skimming over waves like torpedo planes. Now they were ordered to fly at altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, sometimes even lower in darkness, guided by radar and coastal lights. One mistake meant crashing into the sea. Turbulence near the water was unpredictable. Waves could rise suddenly. A blown engine at low altitude meant death. Unlike bombing runs at 30,000 feet, mine missions offered no room for error. Crews compared them to driving a truck through a tunnel with the lights off. Yet they flew. Night after night, wave-skimming bombers sailed over the dark Pacific, engines humming like ghost ships, dropping mines that sank silently into Japan's lifelines. They targeted bottlenecks, places where shipping had no alternative routes. Ports like Kobe, Osaka, and Moji, narrow straits like Shimonoseki, through which most domestic cargo had to move. Rivers, fishing lanes, coal routes, rice routes. Every path Japan used to feed or fuel itself would become a corridor of traps. The first results came quickly. In the spring of 1945, ships began vanishing. Not in dramatic naval battles, but quietly. Merchant captains radioed warnings. Minesweeper crews grew exhausted. Shipyards struggled to repair hulls. Fishing fleets refused to leave harbors. Some ports reported that cargo vessels simply stopped arriving, even when food shipments were desperately needed. Imagine a small Japanese port town before the mining campaign, fishermen departing at dawn, docks filled with crates of smoked mackerel, rice sacks, coal bundles, a pulse of local industry. After the mines were dropped, silence settled over the harbors. Boats rotted at anchor, nets lay unused, and families stared out at seas they were now too afraid to enter. The ocean, once a source of wealth, had become a graveyard waiting to claim anyone desperate enough to work. Factories were already struggling. They needed coal to operate steel furnaces, assembly lines, electric power. Coal came mostly from Hokkaido and northern Japan by sea. Before mining, ships carried coal constantly to feed the empire's engines. After mining, the coal sat in piles, unreachable. Railroads struggled to compensate. Train cars were overloaded. Some provinces rationed electricity to only a few hours a day. Entire factories shut down, not because they were bombed, but because they lacked power. This collapse spread to industries supplying the military. Ammunition plants shut down. Aircraft assembly lines idled. Fuel refineries couldn't distribute product. The Japanese war machine wasn't destroyed in combat. It starved on its feet. And civilians followed the same path. Food shipments dwindled. Government ration boards cut portions. Families measured rice in grams instead of bowls. Children stood in lines outside markets only to return home empty-handed. Farmers no longer sent surplus crops to the cities. There was nothing to spare, and even if there was, transporting it was too dangerous. The mines were never meant to target civilians directly, but war does not respect neat boundaries. Once sea lanes collapsed, hunger seeped through towns and villages without artillery, aircraft, or invasion. Elderly citizens fainted in ration lines, workers in steel factories collapsed during shifts, teachers held classes in freezing rooms because heating coal couldn't be shipped. The empire's propaganda machine insisted that victory was still possible, but ballots of rice disappeared faster than hope. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy scrambled desperately to remove mines. More minesweepers were built, civilian boats were converted, students were drafted into auxiliary naval units, but the dilemma grew worse. Each mine type required a specialized countermeasure, and every countermeasure slowed down the very shipping it was meant to protect. Some ships waited a week just for a safe corridor to open, others never received clearance at all. The Americans escalated again. They deployed combination trigger mines that needed multiple conditions to detonate. They dropped mines with delayed activation timers, so sweepers clearing would miss weapons set to arm days later. They switched trigger types to counter Japanese sweeping technology. No matter what Japan adapted, the mines learned faster. By May 1945, Operation Starvation was sinking or disabling more shipping every month than the entire submarine fleet. The most powerful submarines in history had fought for years to break Japanese supply lines. Now B-29s accomplished more in weeks, at a fraction of the cost, with far less risk. Within Japan's military leadership, panic was not shared equally. The Navy understood the disaster faster than the Army did. Naval officers knew that ships were not just tools of war, they were the bloodstream of the nation. They watched shipping reports shrink to nothing, saw shipyards run out of steel, read messages from captains too afraid to sail. They knew that even the bravest soldier cannot fight if the supply chain dies. But the Army still believed in sacrifice as a strategy. It clung to the idea of fighting to the last man, convinced that courage could compensate for hunger and fuel shortages. Army generals argued that mines were not bullets, not bombs, not weapons of true war. They pushed for massive ground preparation, believing Japan could bleed the enemy dry in a final heroic confrontation. The Navy tried to explain that the enemy wasn't coming for a ground battle. The enemy was suffocating Japan from a distance. Battleships weren't the problem, mines were. But the Army viewed surrender as worse than starvation. Pride clouded logistics. Decisions were shaped by ideology, not reality. One admiral wrote in a report that never reached the emperor, "Even if we fight bravely, we will starve bravely." It was a truth too painful for leaders who preferred symbolic death over strategic retreat. So the Navy kept sweeping mines as best it could, knowing that it was fighting not only the United States, but its own government's denial. The enemy was underwater. The bigger enemy was blindness. Invasion was terrifying, but starvation was unstoppable. You can kill soldiers, but you can't kill hunger. You can sink submarines, but you can't sink a mine that hides beneath the waves and waits. You can rally armies, but armies don't fight without fuel. Tanks don't roll without gasoline. Industry doesn't run without coal. Civilians don't work without food. The Empire's war machine wasn't dying from explosions, it was suffocating. The suffocation spread directly into Japan's defenses. The country was preparing for the inevitable invasion. Fortifications were dug along the coast. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned on hillsides. Reserve troops were stationed in tunnels and trenches. But without fuel, ammunition, and food, these defenses were shells with no substance. Artillery crews sat beside guns with no shells to fire. Anti-aircraft batteries protected empty skies because they lacked ammunition to train. Fighter pilots waited beside grounded aircraft, staring at empty tanks. Some units received barely enough fuel for one flight per month. Others practiced taxiing instead of flying. The defense of Japan was built on weapons that could not move, guns that could not fire, soldiers who could not eat, and aircraft that could not take off. Operation Starvation reached the beaches long before any Marine set foot on them. At Okinawa, the lack of fuel and supplies crippled Japan's ability to reinforce or resupply its own forces. Even units willing to fight to the death could not be supported. Mines prevented ammunition shipments from reaching ports closest to the front. What was meant to be a brutal national defense became a slow-motion collapse. The Army believed Japan would bleed the Americans in a final battle. Instead, Japan bled from the inside. Mines didn't just starve civilians, they starved the very weapons meant to protect those civilians. They were silently destroying the invasion before it happened. And Operation Starvation was just getting started. By June 1945, Japan's shipping system had turned into a nightmare of fear, superstition, and paralysis. Merchant captains whispered that the sea itself had turned against them. Crews refused to board ships. Some fishing companies closed their docks entirely. Shipyards filled with damaged hulls they had no steel to repair. Every port looked less like a gateway to the world and more like a cemetery for rusting vessels. Japan tried switching to smaller boats, believing that lighter ships would be harder for mines to detect. They turned to wooden fishing trawlers and coastal cargo carriers, improvising a desperate new strategy. But the Americans adapted instantly. Engineers created ultra-sensitive triggers designed to detect smaller displacement hulls. New variants were tuned specifically to destroy light vessels. Mines that once waited for tankers and freighters now hunted fishing boats. There was no safe size, no safe route, no safe harbor. The ocean had become weaponized. The Japanese Navy expanded mine-sweeping efforts, recruiting every available body. Fishermen were drafted to sweep waters they once depended on to feed their families. Students were pressed into naval training. Civilian engineers were ordered to help manufacture sweeping equipment. Small boats dragged heavy cables and magnetic loops, desperately trying to clear safe lanes. Every sweep cost fuel they could not replace. Every hour spent clearing a channel was an hour not spent transporting coal or food. The country was forced into a cruel paradox. It needed ships to feed itself, but it needed ships to sweep mines before they could sail, and the mines sank the very ships trying to sweep them. The United States understood that panic itself was a weapon. The more unpredictable the mines became, the harder it was for Japan to operate. So the Air Force altered activation timers, changing when mines became live. Naval planners shifted drop zones, so previously safe routes were suddenly deadly. Some mines exploded days after being planted. Others remained dormant for weeks. The uncertainty was devastating. Japanese officers reported that ship crews no longer trusted the sea. LeMay and his analysts targeted more than harbors and straits. They studied supply chains. They asked, where does this fuel go? Which ports handle rice? Which straits move coal? Which routes feed factories building aircraft? They didn't just scatter mines randomly. They attacked the backbone of Japan's logistics. The goal wasn't sinking ships. The goal was eliminating movement itself. One key target was the Shimonoseki Strait, a narrow, twisting corridor between Honshu and Kyushu. Before Operation Starvation, hundreds of ships passed through it each day, carrying coal, food, industrial metals, and military supplies. It was Japan's economic artery. After heavy mining, it became one of the most feared places on Earth for sailors. Mines turned the strait from a bustling highway into a slow-motion massacre. Traffic didn't just suffer, it nearly stopped. The Japanese Navy attempted to save the strait, deploying large numbers of minesweepers and defensive patrols. They lit the sea with searchlights, filled the waters with sweeping barges, and sent small boats ahead to trigger explosions. The Americans observed all of this and increased mining further. By July 1945, Shimonoseki had become a graveyard of broken ships, abandoned buoys, and desperate crews. It remained technically open, but functionally dead. Every mine a B-29 dropped created more work than Japan could handle. Mines didn't need food, sleep, or fuel. But minesweepers did. Mines didn't wear out. Minesweepers did. Mining the sea forced Japan into endless defense, draining resources faster than the Americans could spend them. It was one of the few times in history where a weapon cost little to deploy but cost everything to counter. Meanwhile, deep inside Japanese ports, coal piles sat useless, rotting under rain. Mountains of black fuel couldn't move to steel mills or power grids. Factories manufacturing weapons shut down, not because they were destroyed, but because they had nothing to burn. Workers arrived at factories and found machines silent, furnaces cold, supervisors confused and helpless. Engineers stood beside assembly lines that had no material to assemble. The war economy didn't collapse in explosions, it collapsed in boredom, with factories becoming quiet tombs of wasted effort. Railroads, once the backup to coastal shipping, cracked under pressure. Too many trains, not enough locomotives, not enough coal, not enough maintenance. Engineers rationed locomotives like medicine. Some cities received only a single freight train per day. Others received none. Crippling coal shortages led to blackouts across major cities. At night, factories glowed dim, then not at all. Households used candles or nothing. Darkness was no longer air raid protection, it was reality. As the national grid dimmed, daily life grew brutal. Housewives lined up at ration offices before dawn, armed with cups, small bags, or even pieces of cloth to hold anything they could receive. Children were sent with coins and told not to return without food. Meals shrank from bowls to handfuls. Rice wholesalers stopped selling to cities entirely, reserving stock for soldiers and farmers. Barter markets appeared in hidden alleys. Clothes traded for vegetables, cooking pots traded for eggs. Black markets thrived, but supply could never meet demand. In fishing towns, sailors gathered at harbors every morning, waiting not to sail, but to stare at the sea. They had lived their whole lives on the water, but now it felt cursed. One fisherman, watching a half-sunk trawler returned by the tide, described the sea as a hunter waiting for our hunger. In cargo ports, dock workers clocked into jobs that no longer existed, sweeping quiet docks, repairing ropes that would never be used. A mechanic at Moji Port compared his workshop to a hospital for ships that would never recover. He stood listening to cranes that no longer moved and engines that would never start again. In cities, mothers stood for hours in ration lines, clutching cups or scraps of cloth like treasure bags, hoping to fill them with rice. Some waited only to find shelves empty by the time they reached the front. Students working in naval mine-sweeping units described the task as living in fear of invisible teeth. They dragged sweep cables with no certainty of whether they would return. None of them imagined dying in the sea before the war even reached their hometowns. Operation Starvation was not loud, it did not scream or burn. It whispered through empty docks, quiet workshops, and silent tables. War had come to Japan in the form of nothingness. In rural towns, farmers hoarded crops out of fear. They watched ships sink in harbors. They saw no guarantee their food would reach the cities, so they kept what they harvested. Without shipping, the government had no power. It could not seize what it could not transport. It could not feed soldiers if farmers refused. Even loyal patriotic farmers faced hunger themselves. They didn't withhold food out of treachery, they withheld it out of survival. Nevertheless, the army still demanded supply for soldiers at the front lines, for kamikaze airfields, for island garrisons, but without shipping, supplies could not move. Some units ate barley mixed with weeds, others ate nothing. Death didn't come from battle, it came from emptiness. As factories shut down, Japan's ability to produce weapons plummeted. In April 1945, aircraft production dropped by nearly 60%, steel output collapsed. Tank factories halted entirely. Ammunition shortages became so severe that some training units drilled without bullets. Armories rationed ammunition as if it were gold. Machine gun crews were told to fire only in bursts of 2 seconds. Artillery units were warned not to waste shells on targets of uncertain value. War became expensive not in money, but in resources that no longer existed. Meanwhile, while the Empire slowly suffocated, B-29 crews continued flying mine-laying missions. They trimmed weight, removed oxygen tanks used for high-altitude bombing, and stripped out defensive guns to carry more mines. Crews trained intensely in radar navigation to drop mines with precision in darkness and fog. They flew through storms, turbulence, and coastal flak batteries that were nearly blind at night. They took risks most bomber crews never faced. It was one thing to bomb cities from 30,000 feet. It was something else to fly at low altitude in darkness, within range of coastal artillery, where one burst of flak could tear through a wing. The mines they dropped didn't explode under their own aircraft, but the danger was constant. The ocean welcomed mistakes with no survivors. For these crews, combat had no loud battles, no dogfights, no dramatic footage. Their missions were silent, deadly, and invisible. The only proof of success came weeks later in shipping reports that read like economic obituaries. Anti-aircraft gunners along the coast did their best. They fired wildly into the dark, but the bombers flew too low, too fast, and often below radar detection. Japanese observers tracked aircraft by the sound of engines. By the time they aimed, the bombers were gone, and the mines were already sinking into the ports. The Japanese Navy kept requesting new destroyers, more escort ships, more mine-sweeping technology, but steel mills were shutting down. Factories had no electricity, shipyards had no material, no fuel, and soon no workers. The Navy was asking for weapons that could not be built. Even if industry had survived, roads could not deliver materials, trains could not transport parts, and the ships needed to distribute finished products could not leave port. In a few areas, Japan tried to replace large freighters entirely, relying on smaller fishing vessels to carry critical cargo. Rice, salt, fish meal, small crates of trade goods, these attempts often ended in tragedy. Small boats detonated mines meant for larger ships, disappearing in flashes of spray and steel splinters. Sometimes crews simply vanished with no explosion, swallowed by waves after striking something invisible beneath the water. Japanese newspapers avoided publishing details. Families heard rumors. They waited for relatives who never returned. Local governments tried to calm the population. They promoted urban gardening. They encouraged citizens to grow food on rooftops, in boxes, in alleys, in windowsills. Posters instructed families to use every scrap of land. Seeds sold out. Children planted carrots and beans beside bomb shelters. Housewives watered vegetables with leftover rice water. It wasn't enough. These gardens produced grams, not tons. Hope grew in planters, but hunger still crept through the cities. American analysts monitored shipping collapse through intercepted communications. Reports showed plummeting deliveries month after month. Coal shipments cut by half, then 70%, then nearly 90%. Rice imports almost ceased. Even coastal transport between Japanese islands became too risky. The U.S. realized that Japan was no longer fighting a conventional war, it was fighting time. Its only hope was surrender before starvation became irreversible. General LeMay later wrote that Operation Starvation might have ended the war without atomic bombs or invasion. Many historians agree the empire was within months, possibly weeks, of total economic collapse. Whether or not mines alone could have forced surrender remains debated, but their effect was undeniable. Japan's industrial heartbeat slowed, then faltered, then nearly died. In total, Operation Starvation laid over 12,000 advanced mines, yet the most astonishing measure of the campaign was not destruction, it was cost. Each mine dropped by a B-29 cost a fraction of what Japan lost trying to counter it. Manufacturing, shipping, and deploying a mine took less effort than building a torpedo, producing a submarine, or constructing a destroyer. The U.S. spent less than 1% of its total bombing resources on Operation Starvation, yet crippled the empire's shipping more effectively than the entire submarine campaign during its peak months. Japan, on the other hand, paid a massive price. Sweeping operations consumed fuel Japan could not afford. Mine-sweeping vessels cost thousands of tons of steel Japan no longer had. Crews risked their lives daily, losing ships before they could even begin their mission. Worst still, every hour spent sweeping mines was an hour not spent transporting food, fuel, or weapons. The sea became a debt Japan could never repay. The economic math was merciless. America invested little, Japan lost everything. Operation Starvation was the rare kind of strategy that didn't just win battles, it bankrupted the war itself. The cost to the United States was low, less than 1% of total U.S. bombing effort. Losses among crews were minimal compared to daylight operations. In return, the campaign destroyed or disabled more than 600 ships and crippled millions of tons of cargo. More importantly, it shut down economic arteries that submarines and bombers alone could never fully sever in time. Some U.S. naval officers later expressed regret that the operation had not begun earlier. One admiral wrote that if mining had been prioritized in 1943 instead of 1945, the war might have ended a year sooner. The Navy had been slow to embrace the strategy, still wedded to battleships and submarines. The Air Force had focused on burning cities. No one initially recognized that victory could come not from destruction, but from starvation. Operation Starvation proved something profound. Wars are not always won by overwhelming firepower. Sometimes wars are won by choking off the ability to fight at all. The mines never fired at soldiers, they never bombarded trenches, they didn't duel enemy warships, they shut down an economy, they killed movement, they killed supply, and without supply, armies die standing still. After the war ended, Japan's harbors remained death traps. Even months later, ships struck leftover mines. Minesweepers from the US, Japan, and even Britain spent nearly 2 years clearing the waters. Many vessels detonated mines long after peace was signed. The ocean forgets nothing quickly. In the end, Operation Starvation was not remembered the way firebombing was remembered. It produced no dramatic newsreels, no iconic photographs. It wasn't loud. It didn't paint the sky in flames. It didn't leave ruins visible from aircraft windows. It left something harder to see: silence in factories, idle trains, rotting fishing nets, cold furnaces, and empty rice bowls. If mining had begun 2 years earlier, some historians believe the war might have ended without the atomic bomb, without Okinawa, and without the firebombing of dozens of cities. Japan's industry was already fragile in 1943. Its merchant fleet was collapsing, its food imports were shrinking. The nation was already surviving on borrowed time. Had Operation Starvation been deployed earlier, Japan might have surrendered out of inability, not fear. Factories would have shut down sooner. Fuel shortages would have reached critical levels within months. The vast island defenses built in 1944 and 1945 might never have been supplied. Millions of lives might have been spared on both sides, not through mercy, but through collapse. Yet the idea came late. The war dragged on, and the world witnessed the fire of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Operation Starvation raised a haunting question. Was the war prolonged not by fighting, but by failing to starve an empire sooner? Japan didn't surrender because its soldiers were defeated. It surrendered because its nation could no longer function. The empire wasn't conquered, it was smothered. Invisible weapons delivered from the sky had dismantled an empire from beneath the waves. Operation Starvation showed that you don't need to destroy a nation's armies to win a war. You only need to take away their ability to survive the fight. And that was the weapon no sailor ever saw coming.